Bill S-206. This is a Senate bill in Canada. Okay. And let's, so the enactment requires the Minister of Finance to develop a national framework to provide all persons over the age of 17 in Canada with access to guaranteed livable basic income. It also provides reporting requirements with respect to the framework. So this is the Senate bill proposed in May of 2025. So this is a current bill. First reading is completed on this bill at this point in time. And it goes on about the preamble about how this is the greatest thing ever. And, essentially what it says is right down at the bottom of the report. Okay. Within 2 years after the report referred to in Section 4 has been tabled in both the House of Parliament and every year thereafter, the minister must, in consultation with the parties referred to in subsection 3, two, undertake a review of the effectiveness of the framework, prepare a report setting out social, health, and economic findings and recommendations related to the implementation and effectiveness of the framework, and cause the report to be tabled in House of Parliament on any of the first 15 days on which that House is sitting after it is completed. So basically, what they're saying is they want to actually prepare a report not on the feasibility of universal basic income. They want to prepare a report on what it's going to look like. And that is, my major, my major issue with this bill. Like, I actually think it would be a good idea, Trevor, for the government to release a report every 2 years on the feasibility of universal basic income, because that would actually, show people, if it was done in good faith, that it's simply not affordable, and it would just take the discussion off the table. Does that make sense to you, Trevor?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, because it is not, it's not feasible. Like, just paying people to stay home and not be productive. We saw what happened with that during COVID. There was so many people who were just sitting at home doing nothing. And then when work commenced, when they were allowed to go back to work, they opted to not go back to work. It wasn't worth it for them to go to their part-time job or two part-time jobs. They just stayed home and did nothing. And it shut the economy down. It closed multiple businesses. It caused us to get massive amounts of immigration. And, we still haven't recovered from that mess. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah. Yeah. And it just says, like, the framework must include measures to ensure that the implementation of a guaranteed livable basic income program does not result in a decrease in services or benefits meant to meet individuals' exceptional needs related to health or disability. The problem is that the government is already in a deficit position. So by nature, any additional spending only becomes, factual with additional money printing, which by nature devalues the services that they can give to anyone else for any other reason. And that is the problem with it. And so, like, I would actually be in favor of a Senate bill discussing on a biannual basis, or every other year, the feasibility of universal basic income, because it keeps coming up. It's a popular political discussion point, and rather it be a discussion point, why don't they actually put some numbers to it? But this isn't to discuss the feasibility of universal basic income. It's to discuss the framework for implementation. And so let's, go ahead and let's show exactly what the where they are right now. This is a Senate bill. It's completed the first reading at the end of May. Okay. The second reading is now in progress, after which time it can go to a third reading. Now, it's a Senate bill. Like, normally the bills would start in the House of Commons and then go to the Senate before achieving royal assent. But because this is a, supposedly a non-spending bill, it can start in the Senate and then proceed to the House of Commons. But it's a very dangerous bill, because it's basically handing them a bazooka, a nuclear warhead of
Mm-hmm.
monetary policy, if you will, that can be enacted at any time. Okay. And I just want to get into a little bit more of like why, who this would go to is it would go to the finance minister and our new finance minister, Francois Philippe Champagne. Okay. He's been in politics since 2015. Okay. But before then, okay. Before then, he studied law, and some people would say, was like, well, he's a lawyer. He must be able to run a company. It's like, no, he was a lawyer. He was internal counsel for Elsig Bailey Process Automation. Okay. And then, after that, he joined AMEC PLC. Now, he was not the CEO or CFO of a public company who stewarded those funds for, 10 or 20 years. Okay. He was internal counsel. So by all nature, it's like for someone to discuss, to determine, the implementation to prepare this report. It's like we have to understand what the qualifications of this person is, and ultimately, it's just really hard to ignore. It's in 2008, he joined AMEC PLC as a strategic development director and was designated a young global leader by the World Economic Forum. I mean, therein lies his credentials. It's not that he was a CFO of a public company,
Mm-hmm.
and he could definitely be trusted to weigh the pros and cons of the fiscal responsibility of a bill like this. It's he was essentially one of the chosen ones, one of the young global leaders from the World Economic Forum, and it's right there in black and white. It's not a conspiracy; it's easily to look up.
Wow, that is,
So
yeah. I mean, that says it all to me. I mean, someone who is, one of the young global leaders, knighted by Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum. They want this universal basic income. They want global control and globalism. So, I mean, it's no surprise that this guy was put into that position. It's not based on qualifications or our best and brightest. It's just he is a useful idiot that they're going to use in order to, implement this program.
yeah, and I just let's look at what this actually looks like. This is the StatsCan, actually the Statement of Government Operations and Balance Sheet, Government Financial Statistics. Okay, so this is going through on a quarterly basis and actually discussing the revenue and expenses of the government of Canada. Okay, and you can see, we're generating, 120 to 130 billion dollars of revenue every quarter. Okay, 120 or 130, because a lot of people will just say like, "Oh, we can afford it. Oh, we can't afford it." And you ask them like, "Well, how much would it cost? Like, how much would it actually cost to give 30 million adults $2,000 to $3,000 a month?" Okay, I bet you it won't be two anymore. I bet you it'll be three. It's so we're talking $100 billion a year. Like that's what we're talking. It's a real number. You can just
Mm-hmm.
you don't need a fiscal study to start looking at some back of the napkin math to see if it's all feasible and all. Okay, so you're looking at $100 billion a year, and then you just start looking at like what our expenses are right now. Like roughly our expenses, on an annual basis are around $500 billion a year. Okay. The last annual reporting that we received suggested that Canada had a deficit of $60 billion. In other words, our tax revenue, our expenses exceeded our tax revenue by $60 billion. Okay. And we're talking about adding another $100 billion to the budget. Now, I
Mm.
know a lot of the UBI people out there will suggest that some of the other social programs would disappear with UBI, but that's not been my experience of government. Is that it would shrink? Okay, and to Trevor's point, like it's a very real point. When you pay people to sit at home and do nothing, they tend to sit at home and do nothing. So any savings that we could generate by reduction in uses of other social programs, there's likely going to be an offset
Mm-hmm.
by decreases in productive people out there paying taxes.
Yeah,
And Trevor, would you say?
yeah, like for sure. Like for me, I think, people staying home, And, they say that you'd be able to reduce the amount of other social programs. I think the other social programs will even boost up higher because they'll find affordability is worse and people's health are going to suffer. You imagine mental health of people not being productive and proactive and being a part of and being engaged in their life. That is a huge, huge issue for mental health, not only physical health. Can you imagine the absolute burden that it's going to put on our healthcare system if all the LPNs and people who are paid, like a lower wage, you're like, it's easier for me to just stay home than go out and do any work. So, there's going to be even fewer people who are going to be engaged in our medical fields and so forth. And then if we bring in immigrants and the immigrants automatically qualify for UBI, just a massive snowball of, a welfare state on steroids. And I think it's highly dangerous.
Yeah. We just look at it from, even if it was just a net, like even if we just had, added an extra $100 billion, and let's just say there's no reduction in tax revenue whatsoever. We just have to look at, what's our GDP right now? It's 1.7%. And you can see like that's actually a pretty healthy clip. We go back to 2015, 2016. This is actually a deficit of GDP. So our deficit is 1.7% of our GDP. Okay. Now, theoretically, people will suggest that you can continue to grow your debt in relation to how you can grow your economy. But, growing in a mature economy, even by 1.7% is a challenge. Okay, so this is actually GDP growth rates. And you can see back in 2015, we had a contraction. In 2016, we were growing by less than a percentage. And right now, we have 2.3% in GDP growth. And we have a reduction of we have a deficit of 1.7%. But you can see bad things happen every couple of years. And all of a sudden you got a GDP that contracts by 12.2%. And when it bounced back, it bounced back to 12.9, but you can start looking, it's like, then it really, really leveled off. You have 0.9%, 1.2%, 0.8%. So the thought that you can grow your way out of it is really just irresponsible. Right now, with a deficit of 1.7% of GDP, and I think that deficit is, if we remember how that financial report was delivered, which was basically, people said it was similar to, someone dropping an illegitimate baby off to the fire department saying, I didn't want it, where all of a sudden, everyone was saying there was going to be a $40 billion deficit, and it turned out to be $60 billion at the last minute. Like, how good is our reporting right now? So I would argue that we're just barely treading water. Like, we are just barely treading water if, our deficit is 1.7% of GDP and our GDP growth rate is 2.3%. To me, that's just barely treading water.
Yeah, for sure. So what else do you have there on this topic?
Therein lies it, Trevor. It's just like we need people to understand like what actually it is. It's the GDP, the universal basic income. It's really not an affordable thing. But this bill is not, it's completely sidestepping the affordability of it. Let's just design the framework. So the red button, the nuclear bomb button, is ready to go on a minute's notice. And let's make sure that, one of the chosen ones from the World Economic Forum is the guy who's going to, sign off on the report that's available. And so I don't actually think that there will be any serious discussion on if this is affordable. That's my belief. Maybe someone will accuse me of being pessimistic, but I actually think that they are going to design this framework. It's written in such a way that people will look at it and saying like, what's the big deal? It's just to release a report. But that report is the same as having like I said, it's just the same as having a nuclear warhead in your military arsenal.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of like social programs and fiscal spending, it is the nuclear warhead.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And have it on ready. And to have it on ready before you determine the fiscal feasibility, because that bill was not written in a way to see if it's feasible or not. It just developed the framework to implement it. Um,
Yeah,
and so I think you
yeah, I don't like that
go
the
ahead,
language
sure.
that they use there. I don't like the language that they use there. That they're developing the framework. You're right. It's like they're creating the red button, right? So that at any point in time they can do it. Maybe discuss, like you've shared with me, a couple of your adventures in Dubai and how the Emiratis, they do receive a monthly stipend from the government of Dubai, from the royal family. Tell me how that works. And
Yeah.
this is a scenario that it actually does work. But let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, it causes you to reevaluate how, reevaluate how a universal basic income could actually be possible. Okay. Because, it doesn't necessarily have to be something that's paid for on the basis of a deficit and infinite debt loops that just get higher and higher that result in more money printing and a devaluation of the currency and a devaluation of your wages and an inflation of the asset prices. It's like you actually can run a surplus. We could run a surplus here in Canada. We raise, call it $440 billion a year in taxes. The problem is we just spend 500 billion. That's the problem. It's not an insolvable solution like right now they have in the US. So it's a complete disaster with their deficit at 7% of 7% of GDP, which is just insane when you look at the spending levels that they have there right now. If we tried that in Canada, like our dollar would likely collapse. But back to your question on how it actually happens in the UAE is they take those surpluses, and everyone will say it's just oil money. It's not just oil money, people. They take those services and they invest it into infrastructure companies. So if you look at who owns the major infrastructure companies in the UAE, so we're talking about the not just the energy companies, but you're looking at the real estate companies, the telecommunication companies, utilities companies. It's like they're owned in part by the government. In much of the Western world, we pretend like these companies are private in nature, as if you had $10 billion that you could immediately get approval to put up all the cell towers and compete with TELUS overnight. It's like they're not. They're quasi-government companies anyways. It's just that we don't get any of the revenue in it. And these companies aren't nationalized. I'm not suggesting that because there's a long history of governments trying to nationalize companies and failing at it. It's just that the government in the UAE has a meaningful interest in these companies, and I would say it helps them not get bogged down in legislation because they have a vested interest. So think about a property development company who can't get approval for a no-brainer development. Look, well, if one of your major shareholders is the government who can get you that development permit, it tends to happen a little bit more efficiently. And so, there's a possibility to actually take surpluses and reinvest it in these companies that actually generate a cash flow on an ongoing basis. And then that can actually pay for social programs, not through taxation or inflation, but actually pay for it with ongoing profits. And that's how they do it in the UAE. And citizens of the UAE do get a monthly stipend, and they're still running a surplus. It's just that we're not in any sort of position to do it when you look at the strength of our fiscal balance sheet on what we actually have in our sovereign wealth fund, if you will, which is effectively the CPP fund, which is a, a, $1 trillion spread across 42 million people, which is not that much. Like it's just not that
No.
much. I think Norway right now is 2 or 3x of what we have in a fraction of our population.
Mm-hmm.
So they've been doing it too. So the naysayers out there who say that's just the that's just uh, a monarchy who can do it. It's like, no, they did it in Norway, they did it in the UAE. It's just, we're not doing it here in Canada. They're not doing it in the US. And when you start throwing around different solutions, people think that the only two countries on planet Earth, if you're a Canadian or Canada and the US, is like there's a lot of other examples out there,
Yeah.
countries who are doing it differently, and they're actually increasing their wealth. Okay. But the government printing fake money and distributing it, all it does is rob you of your purchasing power. They can't ultimately increase the quality of your life because they don't produce anything.
Right. So with that, if this does happen, if we do get this glorious universal basic income, I know exactly what I'm going to do with it. I know exactly what I'm doing with it.
Trevor, what are you going to do?
Every penny of the fake money that comes in, every one of these fake Fugazi dollars that comes in, I'm buying Bitcoin with it, man. I mean, they're going to be funding my Bitcoin portfolio. I'll take mine, my wife's, my son, my 17-year-old child. It's all going to Bitcoin, baby. That's what's going to happen with it, because you're going to have the choice between being poor, dead broke, living in a container apartment, eating bug paste, or you're going to be rich and have some options. Those are the only two choices. That's the way I see it.
Yeah, I actually think it's an inevitable final chapter in the failed monetary experiment, which is fiat currency. Like, I actually think universal basic income is inevitable, whether it's this government or the next or the one after that. It's the inevitable conclusion, not just in Canada, it's the inevitable conclusion in the US. And when it comes out, it will actually be met with open arms, not by everybody, not by the people who understand it, but I mean by the 51% will say that this is somehow the 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 solution to inflation, which is comical because the solution to inflation is a massively inflationary policy. I actually think at some point this becomes the final chapter of the fiat currency experiment. Is they will introduce a universal basic income to solve the cost of living problem, which the cost of living problem is, caused by inflationary money printing. And so I really think that no matter what you say or what we say or who we vote for, ultimately this will be met by people with open arms, because most of the public will just vote for free stuff. And the harder things get, the more likely they are to vote for, this sort of immediate injection. And so whether you're a liberal in Canada or a conservative in Canada or NDP in Canada or a Democrat in the US or a Republican in the US, is like, this is probably the ultimate destination. You're probably not voting your way out of it. Like, how do I know that? It's like, well, you just look at the asset rates and the savings rates of people. It's like, only 3 or 4%, call it 4% of the world's population actually owns Bitcoin, which is the best performing asset in the last 15 years. It's like, of course they're going to vote for it. They've already shown you their level of financial knowledge by, the assets that they're holding. There's 0% allocation to the best performing, finite asset. That's essentially insurance policy on crazy government spending. You just look at it, it's like, people who still have 40% of their portfolio in bonds, which are essentially backed by the faith and credit of governments who are broke around the world. It's the inevitable final chapter. It's the last chapter before we hit rock bottom.